Let's establish something clearly right from the start. A narcissist doesn't fall apart because they simply miss you. They break down because your absence reveals the harsh truth they've spent their entire life trying to avoid. And here is the irony. You were the very thing that was holding their world together. You might have thought you were weak, but just watch what happens when someone who truly cared finally walks away. If this feels right to you, stay with me, because the part I'm about to explain is precisely why their emotional collapse is not your problem, and why leaving was the most powerful act of self-respect you could have made. When we say a narcissist doesn't lose people, they lose supply, it means their emotional structure is completely different from yours. You connect with someone based on shared experiences, closeness, empathy, and genuine affection. A narcissist connects with someone based on usefulness. You are not a true partner in the emotional sense. You are a function, a source of psychological energy. But when the person they lose is someone who genuinely cared, the effect is much deeper because that supply was not superficial. It was grounding, stable, and emotionally consistent. Things a narcissist desperately needs but cannot create internally. A caring person gives them validation that feels richer, steadier, and more comforting than the temporary attention they seek elsewhere. It is the type of validation that makes them feel real instead of hollow, important instead of fragile. They don't appreciate it consciously, and they don't return the favor, but they rely on it in ways they never admit. This kind of supply is not just about boosting their ego. It is about emotional stability. A caring person calms their spiraling insecurities, reduces their anger, helps them manage their moods, and tolerates their volatility. The narcissist doesn't experience this as love. They experience it as balance. You become the hidden buffer that prevents their inner chaos from spilling into their external life. So when they lose someone who actually cared, the breakdown is different. This specific kind of supply is not easily replaced. They can find attention anywhere. They can get admiration, desire, or obedience with very little effort. But emotional stability, true presence, someone who genuinely notices their pain even when they hide it, that is rare. They don't fall apart because they love the person. They fall apart because the person's absence removes the internal support structure they were leaning on without even realizing it. It exposes the emotional deficit they spend their whole life avoiding. They feel the emptiness more severely because the caring person filled it more effectively than anyone else. That's why losing someone who genuinely cared causes such profound destabilization. It reminds them that without external emotional support, they cannot maintain the image or stability they pretend to have. When a narcissist loses someone who genuinely cared, they aren't just losing a companion or attention. They are being forced to confront a psychological truth they are built to avoid at all costs: the emptiness inside them. Narcissism is based on a fragile sense of self that cannot regulate, comfort, or stabilize itself from within. They spend their lives building detailed defenses to avoid facing that inner void: grandiosity, entitlement, blaming others, managing their image, charm, manipulation. These are not random acts, they are survival tactics. They stop the narcissist from ever having to look inward. But when a caring person leaves, those defenses weaken just enough for reality to sneak in. This is why the loss hits harder. A caring person often acts as emotional insulation. They smooth the narcissist's rough edges, anchor their mood swings, and provide a sense of continuity and connection. The narcissist cannot generate themselves. They become a grounding force even while being treated poorly. So when that grounding force disappears, it's not just an absence, it's an exposure. Suddenly, the narcissist is left with the raw truth they've avoided their entire life. Without someone emotionally steady by their side, they quickly unravel. The empty parts of them become harder to conceal behind charm or arrogance. The noise inside their mind gets louder because there is no calming presence to quiet it down. The loss also destroys one of their most important fantasies, the belief that they are naturally desirable, irreplaceable, and worthy of deep commitment without having to try. A caring person doesn't just offer validation, they offer depth. They provide something steady, warm, and human. Losing that forces the narcissist to face the fact that they couldn't hold on to someone who was patient, empathetic, and committed. That realization scratches at their deepest source of shame, the suspicion that there is something essentially flawed about them. Instead of facing that shame, they push it away. They assign blame. They devalue the person they lost. They rewrite the story so they are not the one who failed. But even with all that mental effort, a specific unease remains because a caring person saw them in ways superficial admirers never do. A caring person noticed their fears, their habits, their fragility, and now that person is gone. The narcissist knows, whether consciously or not, that the only person who understood their inner turmoil also chose to walk away from it. This loss briefly exposes the truth that they rely on others for emotional structure and identity. And facing that truth, even indirectly, is one of the most destabilizing experiences a narcissist can have. When a narcissist loses someone who genuinely cared, the resulting destabilization is rooted in one fundamental reality. Their entire sense of self is built externally. Unlike emotionally healthy people who build an inner core of identity through reflection, growth, responsibility, and self-awareness, a narcissist depends almost completely on external validation to feel like a complete person. Their self-worth does not come from inside, it is borrowed. Their identity is not stable, it is reactive. They exist as a reflection of how others see them. This means that every compliment, every reassurance, every sacrifice, and every bit of emotional effort from a caring person becomes part of the narcissist's psychological framework. The caring person is not just a partner or friend, they are a mirror. They reflect back a version of the narcissist that makes them feel important, admirable, or superior. They help manage the narcissist's mood swings, insecurities, and impulses simply by being present and emotionally reliable. The narcissist unconsciously relies on this stability to maintain the illusion of having a solid identity. But because this entire structure is external, it is also fragile. When that caring person leaves, the narcissist is left with no internal structure to depend on. It is as if the lights went out in a room they never learned how to navigate. They can no longer rely on that steady emotional reflection to tell them who they are. Without it, the carefully constructed persona they show the world begins to fall apart. This is why their reactions seem so extreme: rage, panic, frantic efforts to find a replacement, sudden depression, or reckless behavior. These responses are not about missing you as a person. They are about losing the psychological anchor that kept them from collapsing into their own emotional chaos. The caring person's validation acted as a stabilizing force that prevented their fragile self-esteem from completely unraveling. And perhaps the most difficult irony is that the narcissist rarely understands how much of their identity depended on that stability until it's gone. They lack a stable internal core self to rely on. They rely on the emotional energy of the people around them, especially those who care deeply and consistently. So when that person walks away, the narcissist faces a sudden void. The absence feels like a psychological freefall because without external validation, their sense of self struggles to remain whole. Their identity was never strong enough to withstand the loss of someone who provided emotional grounding. This is why the collapse is so intense. Losing someone who cared doesn't just hurt their ego, it destabilizes the very foundation of who they believe they are. A caring person often becomes something a narcissist relies on without ever admitting it, a buffer between them and their own internal chaos. Narcissists live with a constant undercurrent of insecurity, shame, fear of being inadequate, and emotional instability. These feelings are overwhelming, so they rely heavily on the presence of stable, empathetic individuals to absorb, calm, or neutralize these emotional storms. A caring partner becomes the emotional shock absorber in the relationship, taking on the emotional burden the narcissist refuses to face. This buffering happens in subtle ways. The caring person interprets the narcissist's moods, smooths over conflict, escalates tension, explains their behavior to others, and maintains peace. They remind them of important tasks, support their goals, and protect them from the consequences of their own impulsive actions. They step in when the narcissist is spiraling, panicking, or emotionally unraveling. Even when the narcissist lashes out, the caring person responds with patience, logic, and empathy, qualities the narcissist cannot create internally. All of this creates a stabilizing effect. The narcissist relies on this person's emotional management to stay functional. The caring partner organizes the emotional environment of the relationship in a way that makes the narcissist's life more balanced than it would ever be on its own. And because this support becomes so normal, the narcissist takes it for granted. They assume this stability is automatic, not recognizing that it comes from the effort, affection, and emotional strength of the person who cares. But when that caring presence is removed, the narcissist is suddenly exposed to their own unmanaged emotional world. The chaos they've always held back begins to rush in. There is no one to redirect their anger, no one to soften their anxiety, no one to stabilize their impulses. The narcissist's internal emotional state becomes externalized, often exploding as rage, confusion, depression, or reckless behavior. They feel more irritable, more unstable, and more lost. Not because of the loss of love, but because the person who once managed their emotional storms is no longer there. They no longer have someone who instinctively stepped in to make things smoother, calmer, or safer. This exposure is deeply destabilizing. The narcissist is forced to confront the unfiltered version of themselves, the one they've spent their life avoiding. And because they lack the skills to manage themselves emotionally, the internal chaos they once handled through the caring person now overwhelms them. Losing that buffer means losing the fragile emotional balance they depended on more than they ever realized. When a narcissist loses someone who genuinely cared, their usual ways of coping start to fail. This is one of the clearest signs of their internal collapse. Narcissists survive through a cycle of denial, blaming others, rage, and quickly finding emotional substitutes. These strategies allow them to avoid responsibility, avoid looking inward, and avoid discomfort. But when the person they lose is someone who offered real stability and emotional grounding, those defenses stop working as effectively. The loss is simply too destabilizing for their typical tactics to completely hide. One of the first signs is their inability to immediately replace the caring person with someone who fulfills the exact same role. Narcissists can always find attention, admiration, or superficial praise. Those are easy to get, but what they cannot easily duplicate is the depth of emotional support a caring individual provided. So even if they rush into a new relationship or surround themselves with distractions, there is a lack of substance to the experience. The supply they find doesn't soothe them, doesn't regulate them, and doesn't shield them from their own emotional volatility. This leaves them more anxious, more insecure, and more reactive. Their denial also begins to crack. Normally, they immediately rewrite the story. You were the problem, I didn't care anyway, you were easily replaced. But when they lose someone who managed their moods, supported their goals, and provided genuine emotional value, the lie becomes harder to believe internally. They still say it, still act it out, but there's an unease behind their words. The internal conflict grows because a part of them knows that the stability they lost is not something their next source of supply can offer. Their anger also becomes more unpredictable. Rage for them is a method of regaining control and intimidating the world back into compliance. But after losing someone who was actually stabilizing them, rage feels less powerful. It doesn't bring relief, it increases the chaos. They lash out more yet feel worse afterward. The anger no longer restores their feeling of power, it exposes their lack of it. They also try to distract themselves frantically. Work, new people, drama, excessive consumption, anything to avoid the feeling of collapse that is creeping in. But because the new supply lacks emotional depth, the distractions wear off faster than usual. What used to numb them now barely scratches the surface. Their coping mechanisms fail because the loss is not just about their ego, it is about losing the person who maintained their emotional balance. Without that stabilizing force, their old tools no longer compensate for the instability inside them. The tactics they relied on their entire life become weak, ineffective, and unsatisfying, revealing the vulnerability they can no longer outrun. When a narcissist loses someone who genuinely cared, one of the most destructive internal consequences is the collapse of their main internal story. This story is the psychological narrative they tell themselves, a story in which they are always the hero, the admirable one, the convenient victim, the misunderstood genius, the righteous partner, or the irresistible figure. This narrative supports their fragile ego, giving them a sense of superiority and certainty in a world they secretly feel unprepared to face. A caring person plays a unique role in reinforcing this narrative, not because they believe in the narcissist's fantasy, but because their emotional reliability helps create an environment where the narcissist can maintain the illusion. The caring partner absorbs the narcissist's insecurities and makes their emotional world seem less chaotic. They explain away behavior, support their goals, offer compassion, and often lessen the negative consequences of the narcissist's actions without intending to. They help maintain this internal story the narcissist lives by. But when that person is lost, the fragile narrative begins to crack. Suddenly, the narcissist can't maintain the storyline where they are exceptional, adored, or faultless. They face the uncomfortable possibility that if they were truly the person they claim to be, they wouldn't have driven away someone who genuinely cared. That loss introduces a deep mental conflict. Their story says, "I am special and people are lucky to have me." But reality now says, "Someone who loved me walked away." The pain of that contradiction destabilizes them. In response, they desperately try to rewrite the narrative as quickly as possible. They may paint the person who left as disloyal, unstable, dramatic, or ungrateful. They may present themselves as the victim, the abandoned one, the one who was mistreated. They twist the story so the loss fits into their identity structure without forcing them to confront their own failings or vulnerability. But even with all this revision, the original damage doesn't fully heal. That damage grows because losing a caring person removes the emotional buffer that made their grandiosity seem believable. There is no one left who truly listens to their insecurities, who rebuilds them after their meltdowns, who praises their efforts when they feel inadequate. Without that reinforcement, their exaggerated self-image becomes harder to maintain. Doubt creeps in, not the kind they openly admit, but the kind that keeps them agitated at night, fuels their rage, and drives their frantic attempts to replace you. The collapse of their narrative is not just an emotional reaction, it is a destabilization at the core of their identity. Their sense of self becomes shaky, inconsistent, and desperate. They must work twice as hard to maintain a version of themselves that once relied heavily on the emotional grounding you provided. Losing someone who cared means losing the story that protected them from their own truth. When a narcissist loses someone who genuinely cared, They often spiral into a frantic cycle of distraction, rage, and desperate efforts to regain control, not because they genuinely miss the person, but because their psychological environment has been completely disrupted. Their internal world is unstable even on a good day, held together by external reinforcement, consistent admiration, and emotional regulation provided by others. When that caring presence disappears, the narcissist is left without the emotional glue that prevented their inner chaos from coming to the surface. What follows is a quick, disorganized attempt to outrun the collapse they can feel rising from within. One of the first responses is frantic distraction. Narcissists cannot sit alone with their thoughts. Solitude exposes the emptiness they spend their lives avoiding. So they plunge into anything that keeps their mind busy. New relationships, excessive work, constant social media presence, impulse buying, parties, drama, anything that pulls their attention outward. But these distractions don't calm them. They only delay the discomfort. Without the grounding influence of the caring person, the distractions feel hollow and stop working quickly.